The morning Elias Mercer disappeared, the wind in Pine Hollow was still. Not calm still, like the woods were holding their breath. The sun had only begun to melt the mist from the leaves, and the scent of damp pine filled the air, like a whisper of something watching. Pine Hollow wasn't much, just a quiet town flanked by forest on one side and faded hills on the other. But people stayed because it felt untouched.
Safe.
Except for the forest. Locals treated it like a wild animal, mostly quiet, but not to be trusted. They called it Black Hollow, a dense, winding woodland that swallowed sound. Hunters ventured in and came out with stories, some about wildlife, others about strange silences and shadows that didn't move with the sun. Elias had never believed in that kind of talk. He was a practical man, reserved, the kind of person who didn't need to raise his voice to be respected. At 42, he was one of the most experienced hunters in the region. Everyone knew him, the man who could follow deer tracks through fog, who always returned on time, and who could sit in a blind for 12 hours without making a sound. He was meticulous, thoughtful, dependable. That morning, Elias kissed his wife Ruth on the forehead while she poured his coffee. She didn't ask how long he'd be gone. She already knew. 3 days. He had packed light, a hunting rifle, water tablets, dried meat, a lighter, a hatchet, and his journal. His old green Jeep Wrangler coughed twice before starting. Their dog Boone tried to follow him, but Elias shook his head. "You stay," he said gently. "Not this time." Boone whined but obeyed. Ruth watched from the porch as her husband drove down the gravel path, mist curling around the tires. She wrapped her shawl around her tighter, unease settling over her chest like an invisible hand. She didn't know why. It was the last time she'd ever see him. Elias's Jeep was found 4 days later, parked just off a dirt trail near Black Hollow's western edge. He'd entered near what hunters called Widow's Cut, a part of the forest most people avoided, not because of danger, but because of its silence. No birdsong, no movement. Even the wind avoided that part. Ruth had called Elias's brother, Caleb Mercer, when he didn't return by sundown on the third day. "He's never late," she said over the phone. Never. By the time Caleb arrived the next morning, Ruth was pale and silent, standing at the edge of the tree line like she was afraid to blink. The Jeep was there, exactly where Elias would have left it. Locked. Untouched. His emergency sat phone was inside. Turned off. The forest swallowed any signs of where he went next. No footprints, no broken branches, no trail markers. The only hint was the damp, crumpled map in the glove compartment with a faint red circle drawn around an area marked Hollow Ridge. Caleb reported it immediately. By noon, local authorities, search dogs, and park rangers had mobilized. Helicopters flew over the area. Drones scanned treetops. They found nothing. Not even broken twigs. As the hours turned into days, Ruth stayed at home, barely speaking, barely sleeping. She kept the porch light on every night. Caleb, by contrast, refused to stop moving. He coordinated with search parties, organized volunteers, and combed the area himself. On the 5th night, he slipped and fell on a wet rock by the stream bed and cracked his ribs. But the next morning, he was back out with a flashlight in hand. They searched for 10 days, then the search was called off. "He might have wandered off trail and fallen," the sheriff told Ruth gently. "The area is full of sinkholes and ravines. If he's gone, the forest would have hidden him fast." Caleb clenched his fist but said nothing. Ruth didn't cry. She just nodded and walked back inside. The town mourned in quiet, respectful tones. They held a candlelight vigil outside the town hall. Children left pine cones and notes on Elias's porch. A news channel ran a short segment on his disappearance, calling it another tragic case of nature turning deadly. But Caleb didn't accept it. He started hiking deeper. Each weekend, he brought new gear, printed old forestry maps, slept in his truck. Locals whispered that he'd lost his mind. They didn't understand. Elias wouldn't just vanish. Something had happened out there. 3 weeks after the search ended, Caleb broke the lock on Elias's old hunting shed. Inside were things that hadn't been touched in years. Traps, boots, yellowed maps, a rolled-up canvas bag. But it wasn't until he reached the back shelf that he found something that made him stop cold. A photo. It was a black and white print, faded at the edges, of a crooked wooden tower standing above the treetops. Scribbled beneath it, in Elias's unmistakable handwriting, near the hollow where the wind doesn't blow. Caleb had never seen this place before. It wasn't on any official map. He asked park rangers, older hunters, even locals in nearby towns. No one recognized it. But something about the photo chilled him, like the tower was staring back. He pinned it to his dashboard, and every time he went into those woods, he looked for it. Meanwhile, Ruth stayed in limbo. She moved through her days like a ghost, cooking too much food, folding and refolding Elias's shirts, sometimes just standing in the bedroom doorway. Once she opened his nightstand drawer and saw his wedding band, his broken compass, and the torn leather journal he always carried. She closed it quickly, as if it might breathe. At night, she sat on the porch with Boone, watching the tree line. The dog would occasionally growl low in his throat, his fur bristling, staring toward the darkness. On the one-year anniversary, the town placed a bench by the trailhead, with Elias's name engraved on a bronze plaque. Caleb didn't attend. He was 50 miles away, deep in Black Hollow, standing near a dried creek bed, holding that photograph again. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop. It was like something was pulling him forward. Not hope, not obsession. Something else. Something he couldn't name. That night, he sat by the Jeep still, parked where it had been since the beginning. He pressed his hand against the hood and whispered, "You didn't just get lost, Elias. I know you." The wind picked up suddenly, dry and cold. The trees didn't move. 3 years passed, but Elias Mercer's name never left certain lips in Pine Hollow. The forest where he vanished, Black Hollow, grew quieter in that time, almost like it too had gone into mourning. Fewer hunters dared enter it. Fewer families walked its trails. It sat like a secret no one dared to say aloud. Caleb Mercer hadn't stopped searching. Not even once. The weekend after the first anniversary of Elias's disappearance, Caleb quit his job at the hardware store and began mapping every inch of the hollow. He worked nights delivering supplies for a local shipping company so his days remained free. Most of that money went toward fuel, supplies, and equipment. Boots, topographical maps, a metal detector, trail cameras, and a drone he couldn't really afford but bought anyway. People whispered about him. That poor brother still out there chasing shadows. But Caleb didn't care. He'd lost friends, sleep, and even part of his sanity. What he hadn't lost was certainty. Something had happened to Elias. Something the forest didn't want them to find. Ruth, on the other hand, had turned into someone else entirely. Her once warm and vibrant spirit had grown still. She walked slower, spoke softer. She didn't move out of the house she'd shared with Elias, but she did move his things into the attic. She stopped correcting people when they spoke about Elias in the past tense, but she hadn't let go. She couldn't. At night, she sometimes found herself standing at the edge of the backyard, Boone beside her, staring at the woods. There were nights she thought she saw something flicker between the trees, just a trick of the eyes, she told herself. But still, it left her cold. Then came the fall of the third year. The state had approved a new utility line to run through the edge of Black Hollow, not far from the Widow's Cut. Survey teams arrived, followed by contractors and heavy equipment. For the first time in years, part of the forest's sealed interior was disturbed. Most of it was uneventful: soil samples, tree removal, ground clearance. But on the fifth day, something surfaced. A crew had begun draining a deep, algae-filled trench not far from the trailhead where Elias's Jeep was first found. It had become a swamp over time, fed by underground springs and runoff. They were clearing it to stabilize the land for a planned tower base. A backhoe's scoop struck metal. At first, they thought it was a rusted drum. Then one of the workers noticed a familiar curve in the side. It was a Jeep. The same forest green Jeep Elias had driven, the one they'd found 3 years ago near the entrance. Except this one was submerged, half buried in mud, nose first, like it had sunk straight into the swamp. Construction halted. Police arrived. Caleb was notified first. He stood on the edge of the drained trench, staring down into the shallow water. His hands trembled. He knew that Jeep as well as he knew his own heartbeat. But it didn't make sense. "The vehicle we found years ago was parked at the ridge," Tony said. This can't be right."
But it was.
Serial number, registration. Custom deer-embossed keychain still hanging from the ignition. It was Elias's Jeep. Authorities were baffled. They questioned everyone involved in the earlier discovery. How had they missed this? Was there a mistake in documentation? A second Jeep? No one could answer. The strange part wasn't just the discovery, it was the location. The trench where the vehicle was found was nearly a mile away from where it had originally been reported. And no one, no ranger, no local, no search dog had seen it there before. Not during any of the searches, not during drone surveillance. It was as if the forest had relocated it. The vehicle was winched out slowly, metal creaking from years of water damage. Inside, the seats were rotted, the dashboard warped, but the back seat held a sealed canvas bag. Inside, Elias's hunting journal, water damaged but intact, a crushed flare gun, and a cracked old leather wallet that still carried his photo ID. Ruth couldn't speak when she saw it. She sat in the sheriff's office, holding the photo like it might shatter. Caleb sat beside her, eyes fixed on the journal. Most of the ink had run, but not all of it. Several pages near the middle had dried and been preserved well enough to read. They were dated 2 days after Elias had left. The handwriting was frantic, slightly uneven, nothing like Elias's usual neat script. Something is following me, not an animal. I don't see it, but I feel it, breathing where there's no wind. I tried to leave, ended up back where I started, same path, same tree. I'm not alone here. If you find this, tell Ruth I didn't just walk away. Something didn't want me to go. Caleb's skin crawled as he read. Investigators tried to remain objective. They suggested Elias may have become disoriented, panicked. Psychological breakdowns weren't unheard of in extreme wilderness cases. He may have wandered into the swamp, tried to hide the Jeep for shelter or water, then succumbed to exposure. But Caleb didn't buy that. He had hiked these woods for 3 years. This Jeep wasn't here before. Reporters arrived within hours. The story went viral. Hunter's Jeep found 3 years later in remote swamp. Locals buzzed again. Old superstitions about Black Hollow resurfaced. An elder in town told Caleb quietly, "That place was never meant to be trespassed. Some parts of the forest keep what they take." Ruth didn't return to the site. She said it didn't feel right. Said the Jeep didn't feel like his anymore. Caleb agreed. There was something wrong about it. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb reread the journal. His finger paused over one faint line at the bottom of a nearly ruined page. Barely legible. "The trees move when I'm not looking." He looked out his window into the forest, where the pines stood like sentinels in the dark. That's when he knew. The forest hadn't given Elias back. It had simply reminded them it was still watching. In the weeks that followed the discovery of the submerged Jeep, Pine Hollow fell into a nervous hush. People had questions, but no one wanted answers anymore. The idea that Elias Mercer's Jeep had somehow moved on its own, or worse, had never been where they thought it was, planted unease in the town like a weed. Some residents refused to walk their dogs past the western trailhead. Children were kept inside past dusk. Even the forest seemed quieter, as if waiting. Caleb Mercer, however, had grown restless. Elias's journal haunted him. He'd memorized the pages that survived, especially the cryptic, broken phrases. "Same tree again, circle, I never left." He watches between the branches. "Not alone, never alone. Tell Ruth I'm sorry, I should have never gone near the tower." That last line had stopped Caleb cold. The tower. The same decaying ranger structure from the old photograph. He pulled it from the wall above his desk and stared at it again, grainy but unmistakable. The rotted wood, the narrow platform, the fog around its base. Scribbled under it, near the hollow where the wind doesn't blow. He'd seen the phrase before, in Elias's notes, on old maps in the shed. But no official park documentation listed any such location. Still, Caleb believed Elias had found it, and that it had something to do with his disappearance. He spent 2 weeks gathering gear. He charted coordinates from the only topographical map Elias had marked. He planned carefully with extra provisions, weatherproof gear, and a satellite tracker. Then, without telling Ruth, he entered the forest alone. It was mid-autumn now. Leaves scattered in wet clumps along the forest floor. The trees groaned under gray skies. Caleb walked for hours, following the red-marked ridges Elias had once traced with a pen. The deeper he went, the more the air changed. The wind didn't blow here, not even the softest breeze. It was like walking through a held breath. Just before nightfall, Caleb saw it. Rising crooked above the pines was the tower from the photograph, leaning slightly, eaten by moss and time, but still standing. He stood still for a long time, afraid to even blink. Something about it made his chest tighten. Not fear exactly, not grief. Something older, primal, like the tower was watching him before he even arrived. He climbed slowly. Each wooden step creaked, threatening to give, but they held. At the top, Caleb looked out. Endless forest. But then as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something odd. A clearing just below, shaped like a circle. Within it, the trees were dead blackened trunks, no undergrowth, as if fire had touched it, but nothing burned. At its center, a small stone altar covered in vines, and beyond that barely visible an object. He descended carefully, nearly slipping once on the slick steps. His boots squelched into the mossy ground as he approached the clearing. The moment he stepped into it, the air thickened, warmer. He could feel something pressing against his skin, like humidity without heat. The object in the center was a box military-style metal, weathered. He knelt. Inside, wrapped in canvas, was something he recognized instantly. Elias's hunting knife. It still had his initials carved into the wooden hilt. Caleb's hands shook as he picked it up. There was also a torn piece of fabric, a shirt, Elias's shirt, and a photograph. Caleb stared. It was Ruth, younger, pregnant, standing in the very doorway of the Mercer cabin. On the back, a smear of mud and something handwritten. I remembered this. That's when he heard the voice. Not out loud, but inside. A whisper that wasn't quite a whisper. A sensation, like memory surfacing without warning. He turned. There was no one there, but he felt it. The trees weren't just trees. They were listening.
Watching.
He backed away slowly, clutching the box. As he turned, something caught his eye just behind a low tangle of roots. Another photograph. This one was of him, much more recent. From just weeks ago, standing at the edge of Elias's old Jeep, staring into the drained trench. He hadn't known anyone was watching that day. No one should have had that angle. His throat closed. He began to run. The wind never came. The trees didn't move. But he could feel something following, like thoughts crawling behind his back. When he finally made it back to the edge of the trail, breathless and soaked in sweat, the wind finally blew again. And just like that, the forest let him go. He drove straight to Ruth's house and banged on the door, still clutching the box. She opened it slowly, startled at the sight of him, wild-eyed and shaking. "Where have you, Caleb? What is—" He held out the knife, the photo. She gasped. The moment she touched the photograph of her younger self, something shifted in her eyes. Her knees buckled slightly. I don't remember this photo being taken," she whispered, "but it feels like I do." That night, they sat in silence, both too afraid to unpack what Caleb had found. Boone lay at Ruth's feet, growling low and quiet toward the window. Something had changed in the forest. It had started to remember. The next morning, a letter arrived on Ruth's porch. There was no stamp, no handwriting, just a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper with one typed line. "Not everything that disappears wants to be found." Ruth dropped it. Caleb stared at it. They knew now that this wasn't over. Something was waiting. And for the first time since Elias vanished, Caleb realized maybe the forest hadn't taken him out of cruelty or chance. Maybe it had offered him a choice. In the days after Caleb returned from the tower, the world outside continued its routine. But Caleb didn't. He couldn't sleep. He'd sit on his porch long past midnight, staring at the photograph of Ruth, tattered and curled from time, trying to understand why it had been there. He kept Elias's hunting knife beside him, its handle worn smooth, the weight of it both grounding and unbearable. Something about the way the blade had been placed, as if it were a message, refused to leave his mind. Ruth noticed his distance but didn't press. She had started dreaming again too. Only her dreams weren't silent. They were filled with windless trees and shadows that whispered her name. Sometimes she'd wake up thinking she heard Elias's voice coming from the woods. She began keeping the porch light on again. Then on the fifth morning, Caleb woke from a dream where Elias was sitting under a dead tree, pointing towards something in the dark. No words, just the sound of trees creaking. And then silence so loud it shook him awake. That morning, Caleb made a decision. He would go back, alone. He didn't tell Ruth. He couldn't. Some things weren't meant to be explained until they were seen. He packed light as compass, Elias's journal, a flashlight, water, a flare, and the photo. Then he stepped into the forest. The moment the trees swallowed him, everything felt familiar, but not safe. The air was too still. The birds weren't singing. The usual hum of insects had vanished. The deeper he went, the louder the silence became. By midday, Caleb reached the tower. It looked even more broken than before, leaning slightly as if its time standing was coming to an end. The altar at the center of the clearing had fresh moss on it, like time had passed here differently. But that wasn't what drew his attention. A trail of small, stacked stones, carefully arranged, deliberate led away from the clearing. Breadcrumbs. He followed them, heart thudding with each step. They led to a ridge overgrown with brambles. Just beyond it, Hidden under a curtain of roots and mud was the mouth of a cave. It was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. Above the entrance, faintly carved into the stone, was a symbol, a circle crossed by a single vertical line. The same one Elias had once drawn in the margins of his old notebooks. A symbol with no label, no definition. Caleb ducked and entered. Inside, the air changed, cooler, denser, like walking into memory. Water dripped from the ceiling. The walls pulsed with a faint, rhythmic vibration that felt like breathing. And then he saw him. Elias, alive, sitting in a crude chair made of twisted roots and stone, surrounded by candles that hadn't burned in years. His beard was wild, hair streaked with white, face pale and thin. But his eyes, they were clear, alive. Caleb's throat tightened. Elias! His brother opened his eyes slowly. You came. Caleb dropped to his knees. You're alive, you're alive. How? Don't ask how, Elias whispered. His voice was hoarse, brittle. Ask why. Caleb looked around the cave, the silence roaring in his ears. Why are you here? Why didn't you come back? Elias looked past him, toward the mouth of the cave. Because it wouldn't let me forget. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. I went to the tower, Caleb. I thought it was just an old ranger post. But it's not. It's something older. Something that remembers. Caleb leaned in. What does that mean? Elias coughed hard, his entire body shuddering. I saw things, not dreams. Memories, not mine. The forests, it showed me. Everything it has taken. Everything it's held. It's not evil. It's just old and tired. And it needs someone to carry those memories, or they disappear forever. And it chose you? No, Elias said. It offered me a choice. Stay and carry, or leave and forget. I tried to leave. I really did. But the moment I stepped outside, the memories began to fade. Faces blurred. Names disappeared. I forgot Ruth's voice. My own name. Caleb felt his chest tighten. So you stayed. I stayed because forgetting felt worse than death. The silence between them stretched. Why now? Caleb asked. Why let me find you now? Elias pointed weakly to the canvas photo. Because I remembered you. He smiled faintly. I hoped you'd come. The forest. It allowed me one memory. I chose you. Caleb swallowed hard. You're coming with me. Now. Elias shook his head. I can't. You can. I'll carry you if I have to. Elias looked up, eyes glassy. If I leave now, I won't remember what this is. Why I stayed. I won't remember you. Caleb sat back, helpless. So what? You just stay here? Fade into the trees like the rest? Elias whispered, not fade. Become part of the remembering. Then he reached out and pressed something into Caleb's hand. The compass. Caleb looked down. It wasn't pointing north. The forest memory is dying, Elias said. It needs someone new. Someone who remembers but doesn't break. Someone strong. Caleb looked at him, trembling. You're trying to pass it to me. No, Elias said. I'm giving you a choice. A long silence passed. Finally, Elias leaned back, tears sliding down his cheeks. Tell Ruth I love her. Tell her I didn't leave her. I stayed so she'd be remembered. Caleb stood slowly. The forest outside the cave swayed gently now. For the first time in years, he felt the wind. He looked back once and Elias was gone, swallowed by shadow and memory. He didn't remember walking back. He only remembered the sound of leaves beneath his boots and the way the forest no longer felt cold. It felt heavy, alive.
Watching.
Waiting. When Caleb reached the edge of the hollow, Ruth was already standing there. She didn't say a word. He opened his hand and placed the compass in hers. And suddenly she remembered. Everything. The day Caleb returned from the forest, Ruth stood silently by the edge of the trees, holding the compass he had placed in her hand. Something inside her shifted, like a thread that had long been fraying had finally snapped, but not in a way that unraveled her. Instead, it tethered her to something older, deeper. She remembered. Not everything, but enough. Elias's laugh, the way he whistled while chopping wood, the scent of pine on his jacket. For years, those memories had felt faint and slippery, like they were being pulled away, thread by thread. Now, they burned bright and painful behind her ribs. She looked at Caleb, and she knew. The forest hadn't just returned her memories, it had taken something from him in exchange. Did you see him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded. He's alive, but not in the way we think. Tears welled in her eyes. Why didn't he come home? Caleb hesitated. because home would have erased what he became. That night, Ruth lit the old fireplace Elias had built with his hands. She sat on the floor wrapped in a blanket. Boone curled beside her. Caleb placed the hunting knife and photo on the table and opened Elias's journal once more. As the flames danced, they read the remaining legible fragments together. The tower speaks in memory. The deeper I go, the more I forget who I was, but not why I came. The forest does not trap, it invites. To remember is to suffer, but to forget is to vanish. For days after, the siblings said little. They worked quietly in the house. Caleb patched the roof. Ruth cleaned the attic. It was as if preparing the space made them feel closer to Elias, like he might walk through the door if the house remembered him too. Then came the letter, folded and left inside the mailbox. No postage, no name. Just one line typed on thick, weathered paper. The ones who carry memory must walk alone until others are ready. Attached to it was an old photograph this time of the Mercer family cabin. In the window, barely visible, stood the silhouette of a man watching the trees. Neither of them had taken that picture, and neither of them spoke of it again. Weeks passed, then months. Winter came, blanketing the town in soft white. Life returned to a quiet rhythm, but nothing was quite the same. Caleb stopped attending town gatherings. He spent more time walking the forest's edge, often sketching the symbol he saw above the cave over and over in the margins of his notebooks. He wasn't becoming obsessed. He was becoming attuned. Ruth, meanwhile, began journaling. Her dreams, fragments of conversations she swore Elias once had. She claimed she could feel the forest pressing against her thoughts at night, nudging her to remember more. People in town noticed the change. Sheriff Eddings stopped by once. He asked Caleb directly, "You ever plan on telling us what you found out there?" Caleb looked him in the eye and said, "Nothing you'd believe." And that was that. But the town wasn't done with its secrets. One cold morning in January, a young girl named Harper, no more than 7, wandered into town from the forest direction. She wore a white jacket, her shoes soaked, her hair tangled with leaves. When asked where she'd come from, she simply said, "From the place that remembers." Authorities couldn't identify her. No missing child reports, no family matches. But she spoke softly about a man named Elias who helped her find the trail. When Caleb heard, he didn't speak. He just walked out into the snow and stared at the tree line. That night, he told Ruth everything he hadn't shared. About the feeling in the cave, about Elias's fading voice, about the choice stay and carry or leave and forget. He told her the truth he hadn't admitted even to himself. "I don't think I was meant to leave." Ruth's face paled. "You're not going back." "I have to." "No, you came back for a reason." "I came back because he sent me, because someone had to help others remember." Ruth shook her head. "I can't lose both of you." Caleb touched her hand. "You're not losing me. You're gaining the truth." That night, they stayed up watching the fire, neither willing to say goodbye. At dawn, Ruth woke alone. Caleb had gone. He left behind a letter. Sir Ruth, this forest doesn't just hold secrets, it holds memory. Elias stayed because forgetting hurt more than anything else. I've carried his weight long enough. Now it's my turn to walk alongside it, to let it show me what I need to see. If I'm lucky, I'll be remembered too. Love, Caleb. In the spring, Boone started walking to the edge of the trees every morning and sitting there, tail still, eyes fixed on the same narrow path. He never barked. He never chased deer. He just waited. And sometimes Ruth would join him. They'd sit in silence as the forest whispered, not in words but in reminders. Sometimes it was the scent of Elias's cologne carried on the wind. Sometimes it was the sight of stacked stones along the creek. And sometimes, rarely, she would hear the creak of wood like a tower swaying in the distance. And she'd smile, because now she knew the forest didn't take them. It chose them, to carry the pain, to remember the lost, to remind the world that even silence echoes if you listen closely enough. Years later, when new hikers came to Pine Hollow, they were warned not to go too deep into the woods, especially near the old trail where no birds sang. Some listened, some didn't. But every so often, someone would come back different. Eyes older, heart heavier, words softer. They'd never speak of what they saw, but they'd always ask for a journal, because the forest only speaks to those ready to remember.